I remember the first time I arrived on Earth. How could I forget it? I was a young, ambitious commander who had barely received his military antlers. It was by far the most important mission I ever had conducted. In fact, it probably would have been even if I was admiral. A new species had been discovered, one with unmatched potential. They were the first of the 7 lesser races to have developed an actual technological civilization and would be able to fill many niches we still needed servants for. Scientists, engineers, doctors, petty officers, and bureaucrats, all these jobs could finally be filled by others than Mazirs. That would unlock the next stage of our evolution. All Mazirs would become functionally nobles, just like the enslavement of the first lesser races had ended Mazir slavery. The world would as such get closer to natural order. There were even some theologians arguing for the creation of a middle race status. The idea being that species like humans would end up always higher in the hierarchy than other slaves, and it should be reflected by the law. Some went as far as proposing to give them small antlers so they could more effectively direct their subordinates. But not everything was perfect, of course, or I wouldn't have been sent there. First, the logistics of conquering a world so far away were quite convoluted. Earth was 1,500 light-years away from Emoar, nearly 3 times further than the previous record holder. With a decent drive, it would take 2 weeks to reach. Such long jumps were unheard of, except on long-distance scientific expeditions. Keep in mind that you would need to traverse 1,000 light-years of unclaimed space. But that was not the main problem. While humans had unmatched potential as slaves, they also had one for troublemakers. In fact, it was soon decreed after the conquest that no human should be brought to the Inner Empire until their cure was ready. This, in turn, made the development of the cure slower, but the higher-ups wanted to be careful. In retrospect, the careful course of action would have been to glass them on the spot, but we were too blinded by the endless possibilities enslaving humankind offered. Besides, them falling under our wing was the goddess's plan, so it would happen eventually. My job was to help with the repression efforts, but I wasn't good at it. First, I was too soft, according to my superiors. I always had a hard time executing and torturing, and humans were only amplifying the issue. Maybe it's because they weren't cured, and as such still fought until the last second. I was also too careful with my resources. I still have a written note my captain sent me. Soldiers are meant to be used. We almost have too many Krezls back home, and while they're expensive to transport and shouldn't be wasted, you still need to take initiatives. If you never take risks, you'll never win anything. Judging the risk-reward balance is something you cannot learn in a school, but here, you have a perfect opportunity. So, use it. And don't worry about sending your soldiers to certain death. Considering the antlers you wear now, they will never disobey. I tried put his advice to use, but it didn't work. To my great shame, I was called back home after only a year. My mother took it as yet another proof I would never achieve anything in life. But outside the field of operation, I proved a competent administrator, and I was promoted captain after a few years. I wasn't very informed about humans after that. I wasn't really involved with them. I just knew progress on the cure was very slow, and some had managed to flee Earth, but the blockade had been reinforced, so that wasn't a concern anymore. Once the cure would be ready, this handful of rebels would quickly fall back in line, and all these small annoyances would soon be forgotten. Jonathan Dream. Chapter. I don't remember the first time I left Earth. I was 7, old enough to form memories, but for some reason, I just don't. Maybe it's because it was a hard part of my life. My parents had abandoned me, and while I didn't know it at the time, they just had been executed. It was only 3 months after the Mazirs attacked, and people were fleeing as fast as they could. I had been picked up by an emigration shuttle because they were followed by a Mazir patrol, and they couldn't get everyone on their list. So instead, they just took whoever they could. It still amazes me that the exodus was performed by less than 200 stolen ships. In the first 2 years, before the Mazirs made security so tight that leaving Earth was suicide, they managed to get more than 40 million people out. Guests were more efficient when desperate. And we were desperate. We had witnessed the armies of the world getting destroyed, and Earth turned into a giant prisoner camp in less than a week. Our only chance of survival was fleeing. So we reached for that goal with everything we had. We learned more about life in space during the first months of the Exodus than in our entire history before that. We learned about electronic thrusters, hydroponic greenhouses, Alcubierre drives, and industry in space. By the time I reached Dream City, quite the ambitious name I know, we knew how to run a space civilization somewhat reliably. I grew up in a place that no longer exists. Dream City still does, but it's nothing like what it was at the time. The city was dug in a massive asteroid to protect us from radiation and be less visible. In place of a city, it was more like a massively scaled-up version of the ISS, at least on the inside. Endless corridors stuffed with machines, rooms only for producing food or the heavy industry, wires and pipes running bare on the walls, and no real place to sleep. Every resource was precious. Everything needed to be recycled. 500,000 cubic meter to house, feed, and supply oxygen to 10,000 people. I hated it. I miss it now. I was a 7-year-old child who didn't even know his family name, in a space station of a technological level that could only be operated by trained astronauts. I had a lot to learn, so I did. I learned hauling things around, cooking, machining, maintenance, electronics. I learned to read and write, mathematics, physics, and engineering. As I grew up, I learned construction, piloting a mining ship, operating a defense turret. What I didn't learn was people, leisure, and friends. Everyone knew me and most liked me, but I still was alone. So I spent my childhood dreaming of freeing Earth, to reunite with my parents. I wanted to fight, and the opportunity arose when I was 16. By now, spacefaring society was much better established. We had better tech, more manufacturing capabilities, and we could build our own ships. As such, the colonies were being upgraded to actual cities, and Dream City was no exception. We were building actual housing and farming areas capable of producing more than algae sludge, plus a bit of real food. Most importantly, we were building factories unlike anything we had before, and even a dockyard. All of our production lines were highly automated, which multiplied our industrial output by 10. And we were building weapons, and people were encouraged to learn how to use them. The ships we built would not be cargo haulers, but machines of war, to reclaim the solar system from the enemy. Of course, the preparation would be long, but revenge was finally getting closer, and I would be of those who enacted revenge. Today was the big day. Operation Phoenix, the beginning of the real war. But for now, I was just taking breakfast with the rest of the crew, and let me tell you, I was savoring it. Orange juice, eggs, bacon. I hadn't eaten that well since I left Earth. It was all synthesized in a lab with genetically modified bacteria, but still. The last meal before the execution, joked the captain. Oh, come on, our chances of survival aren't that low. Let's talk about more positive things. What place on Earth would you want to visit first? It was Maria, the second in command. Well, it's probably going to be wherever we land, and it won't really be planned. You know what I mean, Jonathan, after we win. Don't get ahead of yourself. The battle is still far from won, and even after that, I doubt we'll have the time for tourism. We outnumber them 100 to 1. How could we lose? Well, for starters, their ships are probably at least 100 times better than ours, so the disadvantage is for us. Why do you have to be such a killjoy? We're gonna win. They're like 2 weeks away from Earth, so it'll take them at least a month to even send reinforcements. Everyone, please stop bickering. We have a tight schedule, and we only have 2 hours left before leaving. I loved my crewmates. They were the first people I really felt close to in a while. We met 4 years ago, during the enlisting campaign. At the time, we were still working our regular jobs, and some extra training after that. With time, training and learned for the Army took more and more of our time until we were essentially full-time soldiers. Were we ready? No, but we were trained enough to operate a ship and fulfill our mission, and determined to do it. And Earth could not remain under Mizir rule for a minute longer. When we boarded the Pungicius, I felt strangely at peace. I mean, I had non-negligible chances of dying in the next 24 hours, and that didn't bother me at all. Those of us who had family in the city gave them a farewell, and we left. The Pungicius was, for all intents and purposes, a terrible craft. It looked more like an old space station, but with weapons and engines. It was about as big as the ISS, perhaps a little smaller. It had 2 batteries of missiles and 4 machine guns, 1 electronic thruster, a 35,000 C-class warp drive, and 2 drop pods, because needless to say, that thing wasn't going to survive in an atmosphere. But its point wasn't to be good. It was to be cheap. Dream City had built 100 ships, so they weren't going to be great. Still, looking by the cupola, I could the biggest fleet I had ever witnessed, before we spread out too much to really see each other. Then I saw FTL jump for the first time in my life. The ship that made me leave Earth didn't have windows in its cargo bay. I expected nothing and was not disappointed. That what you saw outside the window, nothing. The warp bubble is completely isolated from the rest of the universe. The trip to Proxima Centauri was pretty long, about 5 hours. The ship's AI was piloting, so we played cards, inspected the weapons, and just tried to pass time. When we reached the rest of the Armada, in orbit near 3rd York City, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was as if the sky was filled with way more stars as usual. Of course, it was just the largest armada humanity had ever built. Granted, the ships held an average of 10 crew members, but it was still 10% of the free human population. I kinda hoped we could see the other ships, grumbled Maria. Well, we can see them. You and your technicalities! I want to see the archangels with my own eyes, that's what I meant. Well, we'll probably have the occasion to see one after the battle. Who knows, maybe by the end of the war, we'll all be commanding super archangels. Paul certainly sounded optimistic. The atmosphere was certainly getting more tense by the minute. We were now less than an hour from the jump. The last thousands of ships were arriving, and I was reviewing the different models. While they were all built from the same base components, they were nothing but standardized. It looked like every city had their own slightly different design. At least everyone agreed on the basics. Fighting a war in space is hard. Like, very hard. You'd think that an environment as hostile as the Void would make it easier to destroy a ship. Well, you'd be half right. If your hull is breached, or any of the innumerable systems needed for life support is broken, it's over. But actually doing that is hard. Sure, no ship can survive a missile or a railgun shot, but hitting is a different story. A good missile can reach Mach 10, a good railgun Mach 20. I'm talking about those we have today. It was way less at the time. While these speeds are impressive, space is big. Let's say the enemy ship is 2,000 kilometers away. That is to say, right next to you in a stellar system. Well, that give your opponent 5 minutes to dodge. The solution is obvious. Energy weapons. They travel at the speed of light, or almost. So it's impossible to do better than that, unless you want to strap a warp drive to a missile. Now, you can hit a target millions of kilometers away in a reasonable delay, and it's literally impossible for them to see it coming. But now you have a new problem. Lasers, particle beams, plasma bubbles, they all spread with distance. So, unless you can afford gigantic beams to cook your opponents for hours, your range will also be limited. But since your opponent probably wants to destroy you too, they will get closer to you, until you're in the range of their weapons. In such a situation, having a longer range than your opponent gives you an enormous advantage. And so, the Mazirs had spent centuries upgrading their energy weaponry, and could now reliably fight at a distance of 10,000 kilometers. Unfortunately for them, in the coming battle, their range would not be of any use to them. The ships around us started to move in different directions. Since momentum is conserved during the jump, you would usually warp somewhat far away from the planet to have room for maneuvers. You didn't want to ram into a planet at dozens of kilometers per second, after all. But here, we were going to warp directly at different positions of Earth's orbit. As the universe became black once again, I knew that in an hour, we would warp in an active battle. Calm down, breathe. That's just going to be the most important battle of all times. The day before we learned about the human attack, everything was pretty much normal. I was in my office in the local citadel, working on a report about the performances of different combat units during exercises, and planning a new order for Riffles and Krezel soldiers. My job wasn't the most thrilling, but it needed to be done. I was essentially doing the administrative chores of my superiors. They gave them to me because they knew I could do them well and quickly. I was the head of administration of the Citadel, even if it wasn't official. That was pretty much the only reason I had been promoted captain, and I wasn't going to actually be in charge of a ship, except in a case of extreme emergency. Still, I kinda liked it. I was never very ambitious, and this slow and peaceful life was enjoyable. I made a decent amount of money, had a pretty respectable job, just not much free time. At least, that gave me an excuse to avoid finding a wife for a little longer. Freedom was a rare commodity for a man. Before. I also knew that logistics and administration was important for an army. Of course, all officers in the army had been told that. I mean, that was pretty much half of Gira's war in its totality. But many acted like they didn't take that into consideration. And so, if I did it for them, that made me much more useful than a regular captain. I was just sending my Lycom assistant to get some documents when Commander Zedby entered the room. He was young and eager to fight, like most people enlisting in the military. Unlike most people enlisting in the military, however, he was a noble, and felt as if that made him entitled to a higher position. He wasn't completely wrong, since given his results at the academy, his nobility was the only reason he had been accepted. Did you receive orders for my deployment yet? I was told you were the one handle that around here. Of course, no sir, captain, or any form of politeness, really. I still was his superior, nobility or not. I'm afraid not, Commander. I put emphasis on his inferior rank. It's a pretty peaceful year. Do you think there's hope for something soon? No, thankfully, shouldn't we rejoice? He was looking pretty disappointed. That means we are good at preserving the Empress's peace. Yes, but I would like a way to show that I'm more eager than most to defend that peace. He was not even trying to hide his feeling of superiority. It didn't matter for him to be good or bad, just better than the others. Wait, what about Earth? Perhaps they could send me there? Trust me, you don't want to be sent there. 1 month of travel time makes everything so difficult. Supplying the army is a logistical nightmare, and instead of battles, you'll just be fighting guerrilla warfare and trying to keep the populace at bay. Still, it's better than doing nothing, and I'm sure I would last more than a year there. Did he just say, "I'm better than you" to one of his superiors? Was he stupid or just incredibly egotistical? Well, I'm afraid I need to get back to work. One last thing, Commander. Remember, it's your superiors who decides who gets promoted, so try to get on their good side. Are you threatening me? Of course not, simply giving you some advice. He probably didn't deserve it, to be honest. After that, I finished my day of work without any incident. Ulmi, my Lycom butler, was waiting for me in the car. He was my only servant, but he was more than enough to care of my small apartment. Well, I say my, but I was renting it, of course. That wasn't so easy to find, since women would always buy their housing, and most men were content with living at their mother's before finding a wife. I somehow managed to get one not too far away from the Citadel. The landlady was insufferable, but thankfully she always sent her husband to do her bidding. It's pretty late already. Could you start preparing dinner? Of course, Captain. Would Zri soup sit your taste today? Yes, that would be great. I'm going to be working on something in the office. Tell me when it's ready. I worked on some transfer orders, nothing really interesting, but it needed to be done, preferably by me. I had a lot of work by Mizir standards. Only half of adults had a job, most people simply living of their private income. Even if you had a job, the average work week was about 20 hours. That was higher in the army, but even there, it was rare to work 10 hours a day like me. After that, I ate dinner with Ulmi and chatted with him a little. It was unacceptable for a Mizir to hold that kind of conversation with a member of a lesser race, but I didn't care, since no one would know. Besides, I was lonely, and it was a good distraction. Captain, did you hear what happened at the market? No, was it something important? Not really. A Madzi vendor tried to run away and was shot. The cure failed, probably. It happens. Still, if that were to happen to me, I would report it to you. Why would you want orders to be harder to follow? That's just stupid. Ask that to the humans. I heard that progress on their cure has not progressed for 2 years. Yes, but humans are capable of more decisions-making than us. It makes sense they'll want a bit more freedom. Well, at least you're not getting replaced soon. I don't want a butler that takes initiatives. After that, I went to sleep, blissfully unaware of the frenzy that had taken hold of the closest planets to Earth. The sky, through the windows of the ship, was black. The sensors were blind to any outer signal. We were separated from the rest of the universe, headed to the first space battle we'd ever fought. 3 minutes before, we'd re-enter into regular space into an active war zone. To say the atmosphere was tense would be an understatement. We were all focused on our stations, trying not to think about what would happen if we were to end our warp on the trajectory of a projectile. The captain tried to make a joke about the fact that we were nearly back home. It fell flat. 2 minutes. I was sweating intensely, trying to maintain my position despite the absence of gravity. I suddenly remembered that Earth's gravity was higher than what I was used to in Dream City, and I was going to have a hard time readapting to it. 1 minute and 30 seconds. Someone coughed. 1 minute 20. I could hear my heartbeat. 1 minute 10. The final minute was the longest of my life. Each second was worse than the last. What would we find? Maybe the Mizirs had hopelessly crushed us, and we would be dead. Maybe in desperation, they had glassed Earth. Maybe space was suddenly filled with stars again, and above us, a planet in the night. It was not nearly as lit up as the pictures from when I left. Yet that was North America. That was not a good sign, but no time for contemplation. Nearly indistinguishable for the naked eye, but perfectly visible for our sensors, projectiles and energy beams were fired all around us. After a bit of frenetic search, we detected a Mizir ship 200 kilometers away. We started firing missiles towards it. Alone, we would stand no chance, but the hope was to overwhelm with sheer numbers. Fighting in space was weird. You couldn't see your opponent. Everything was silent. It wouldn't feel different if the buttons you pressed did nothing. And yet, you knew you were fighting for your life. It could all end in an instant. In the insufferable silence, you could feel the dread consuming your crew. It was just wrong. War shouldn't be calm and silent. You should feel each shot, each fallen comrade, each enemy killed. It should unbearably noisy. The alternative was much worse for your psyche. To this day, I still think my issues all stemmed from that. War at the time did not give sufficient feedback. That may sound silly, but anyone who experienced battles at that time will confirm it to you. It was short. Soon enough, we realized we were being targeted by the enemy ship. We could detect the beams of energy close to us. It missed us 10 times, each time getting closer to hit. We wouldn't survive a single hit. The captain knew that. He ordered us to move to the re-entry capsules, to drop in North Africa, the next landmass we would fly over. We had already sealed the airlock when our ship finally got hit. One of the two big radiator panels had been blown off, and the ship was losing coolant at an alarming rate. We couldn't drop immediately, however, because we would land in the Atlantic. We had to wait for more than a minute to undock. We didn't have access to any sensors in the crowded pod, but I had no doubt the attacks were still raging. Finally, we undocked, and I was pushed into my seat by the one-time use rockets deorbiting us. The space battle was over for us. It had lasted about 15 minutes, in which we launched our missiles and waited to be hit while preparing our escape. Definitely not as interesting as what I hoped for. I knew it would look like that from the simulations. But still, as I felt the deceleration of our little pod, I was thinking about the fact I hadn't had the time to say farewell to the captain and his ground team. There was a good chance we would never see them again after all. But looking at the containers pack with weapons around reminded me the most important part was coming. We were going to free our planet in a more traditional form of warfare. I smiled. Based on what I'd seen, we still had good chances of winning the battle in orbit, and their soldiers on the ground were barely a glorified police force. The Mazirs had the advantage in this war, but for this battle, they didn't stand a chance. The deceleration slowly diminished, then spiked, telling us that the parachutes had deployed. We were almost there, and we could mostly feel Earth's real gravity by now. It was stronger than what I was used to, but we had exercised a lot for that exact reason, and it shouldn't give us any trouble. With a loud noise, we finally reached the ground. We got out one by one, unloaded the supplies, and assessed the situation. The GPS system had long been destroyed, but we could estimate that we were probably somewhere in Algeria or Tunisia. Maria, the leader of our ground team, was thinking about how to contact the locals when we heard a 4x4 nearby. On its back, there were a couple of people waving and shouting happily at us. After they got down, they started explaining the situation. As soon as people realized what was happening in orbit, they rose up, and the Mazirs freaked out. They almost all fled to their various strongholds to wait for reinforcement. The people in the car were part of a group that formed to attack a research facility nearby. When they saw the capsule, they hoped the people inside could help them and arm them because what their current arsenal was pitiful. They had 10 rifles for 30 soldiers. Maria was in a delicate situation. She couldn't really say no to people who finally had some hope after more than a decade. But she knew we didn't have the resources to break such a stronghold. She ended up asking me my opinion, since I was her second in command. So, what do you think? Well, there are only 4 million trained soldiers for an entire planet, and a significant portion of them are probably dead by now. We can't really expect reinforcements. This stronghold is probably full of vehicles and weapons, which will help us take their stronger bases. This is just a research facility after all, so it won't be heavily fortified. It won't if we attack now at least. We can't allow them to entrench it. You're right, we should attack. And so we did our best to fit the 5 of us and the supplies in the back of the truck. We regrouped with the rest of the militia a dozen minutes later. After giving them weapons and explaining how to use them, a rather difficult task considering the translation AIs we had with us were not very good, we started our advance towards the Mazir base. We reached it around noon, and the heat was getting difficult to bear. It looked a bit like a stone palace and clearly contained inner gardens and decorative pools. The Mazirs sure had a taste for luxury. The good news for us was that it was at the bottom of a small valley, a hard position to defend. Maria and I got closer to observe it with binoculars when we heard a detonation. We knew, thanks to our training, that we should get on the ground as fast as we could. But there is a difference between having learned something and the experience you could get in real combat. 7. It was this difference that costed Maria her leg. She was hit in her thigh, and I carried her on my back to cover. I noticed blood was getting out in pulse. This was really, really bad. She had been hit in an artery. The doc was able to stop the hemorrhage, but she passed out from the blood loss. That meant I was the one in charge now, I was thinking. We had explosive, and I had noticed several boulders on the side of rather steep hills. It was time to teach the Mazirs a little something about the strategic placement of fortifications. Setting up explosives while under the fire of snipers was no easy task. In fact, we lost 2 guys in the operation. This needed to work, or I was done for. I had selected a boulder that would hopefully breach the wall near a garden to limit casualties. As soon as the explosives and everyone was in position, I pressed the button. No point in wasting time. With a burst of white smoke, the rock was sent tumbling down the hill, pushing others down the same path. Soon, A proper avalanche was heading towards the research facility. We were running after it, using the cloud of dust to hide us from the snipers. As much as I want to describe it as a heroic charge, the truth is, we looked like idiots, running down a hill trying to not stumble. But we reached our destination mostly unharmed, and we entered the building through a now wide-open corridor. While our point of entry was completely devoid of life, I had no doubt we were outnumbered. Beyond that, the enemy had the advantage of the terrain and technological superiority. We would need a solid plan to win. Thankfully, this place was not intended to be a fortress, and it showed. Namely, there was a map of the entire complex on the wall, complete with a "You are here" marker. Convenient in everyday life, even more convenient for an invading force. A quick look at it confirmed my suspicions about the facility's design. It was split up in several wings: research, housing, storage. At the center, there was a tower housing the administration, including the director's office. That gave me an idea. Mizir society was highly hierarchic. Their soldiers, the Krezels, were literally incapable of disobeying. If we could force whoever was in charge to surrender, we'd win. But if I realized that, chances were the enemy had as well. The tower was probably heavily defended. We couldn't pierce their defenses at full strength, so we would need a diversion. I gave a few Molotov cocktails and even one of my grenades to a group of 4 soldiers, with the instruction to cause the maximum of trouble at the north door, the closest to our current position. Then the rest of the group and me would attack through the south door. We traveled as fast as we could while trying to remain undetected when we encountered our first enemies in ground combat. A small group of Krezel soldiers, visibly changing position. Krezels were simply following orders. In fact, they were incapable of not doing so. I couldn't help but feel bad for them. Still, it was a life-or-death situation. We shot them without hesitation. I was worried we just gave away our position, when seconds later, we heard a gunfight on the other side of the tower, followed by the recognizable sound of a grenade. Shit, I thought. Too early. We ran towards the south door, only for it to bust open, revealing a small army opening fire on us. Thankfully, we were near an intersection and could take cover in the nearby corridors. So casualties. We were, however, stuck in an exchange of fire where the losers would be the first to run out of ammo, and that would be us. We needed a disruption, fast. In the nearly deafening noise of gunshots, my mind was racing. There was a window giving on a courtyard in the corridor, and another in the tower. With the butt of my rifle, I broke the window, thankfully made of regular glass and not sci-fi super materials. I got through with more difficulties and cuts I would like to admit. Then, I pulled the pin of one of my grenades, fired a few shots at the tower's window to fragilize it, and throwed the deadly chunk of metal. As it was making its way toward the window, I prayed to every god that could possibly impact the structural properties of glass that it would not bounce back. I was apparently heard, and the grenade smashed through the glass seconds before exploding. After the shock of the detonation, the fighting stopped. As I awkwardly entered the tower through the window, I was greeted by the sight of a massacre. These grenades were supposedly marvels of engineering, capable of stopping an entire army. I could now attest the veracity of this claim. Tiny spikes of tungsten titanium composite steel had been projected in every direction by a carefully prepared cocktail of explosive, piercing through protection and bodies alike. Several fancy pieces of furniture had been used as cover facing the doors, but they had completely overlooked the windows. More than 100 Krezel soldiers and 2 Mizir officers lay dead, shot in the back by a single device. When the others entered, they congratulated me, but I was not happy. I was scared. Scared of the power that had been put in my hands. It was then that I realized how much bigger this war was going to be. Not only would there be an absurd number of soldiers involved, they also would be absurdly powerful. I then realized that from the perspective of the Mizirs, the battle for Earth was merely a skirmish, and I decided it would be best to stop thinking for now. We faced nearly no opposition climbing the tower. Apparently, they had put everything they had on the ground floor and hoped we could not pass through. Now that we passed it, they were done for. We soon reached the last floor, which contained only the director's extravagant office. There, we found about 50 Mizirs and a few members of an unknown species. I approached the Mizir seated at the desk, assuming he was the director, or maybe she. I had never seen a Mizir woman before, but the individual before me looked very feminine. She also had impressive metal antlers, looking things attached to her head. As far as I could tell, these things were worn by all Mizirs, and their size and complexity depended on rank. I activated my translator and ordered, "I demand your total surrender. Order your troops to lay down their weapons." "You little... How dare you speak to me in this way? I will never surrender to you!" Instead of responding, I shot her in the foot. Crying in pain, she pressed a button and spoke in a small microphone. Soldiers and civilians, this is Lady... She had difficulties speaking through the pain. Lady Doremia, our facility has formally surrendered to our opponents. Lay down your weapons and cooperate fully with the invaders. Our little group erupted in joy. I couldn't believe my ears. We had won! This victory came at a cost, of course. We had lost 12 men and had at least 8 wounded. But we had won, against an enemy 4 times more numerous. I couldn't do much now but hope the results were as good everywhere on Earth.